When we talk about quantum psychology, I don't know what other people mean, but what I mean is the ability for the mind to be quantum style, to be open to the fact that there are multiple realities that we can hone in on and shift into, but those that are coming from a binary society may not be awake to this fact. So if you are, congratulations, welcome to the club. I don't have all the answers. I do have my PhD in neuroscience from Georgetown. I'm super proud about that. But, and this is a big but, I didn't study any of this in my PhD. So even though I am a neuroscientist, technically I'm not really qualified to teach you about these topics because I'm just learning it myself. In fact, I calculated the number of hours that I've dedicated to researching this, most of which has been observational studies with an N of 1, aka myself, which if you are a scientist, you know this doesn't pass the sniff test. You know, like you can't just like use yourself and make all of these scientific conclusions. So what I'm about to share with you is that I have been researching this and observing these phenomenon mostly on myself for about the number of hours that would place me at year 3 of being a PhD student. So I have my master's, quote unquote, my unofficial master's in quantum psychology. Is that really a thing? I don't think it is. I've dedicated that much time to exploring it, and then a year more. But at year 3 of a PhD, you're just now able to understand that you understand some things, but there are some serious misunderstandings that you have that you don't know that you have. And you're still sort of synthesizing everything, and you can make a proposal and you can submit it to a committee, but there's no way in hell that any experts would pass you at that point. So that's where I'm at when I share this stuff with you. As we start to open our minds to the fact that we can reality shift, we have to practice cognitive flexibility. It is critically important. And I happen to believe, there's no scientific basis for what I'm about to say, but I happen to believe that those who are neurodivergent are exceptionally good at this. And this is almost like a superpower that they don't know that they have. That actually, if you have something like ADHD or giddiness or autism, this can actually show up as deficits in your life. When I believe that when we start to expand into quantum psychology and reality shift, that is actually an asset. And so your ability to shift attention very quickly, very rapidly, I guess in autism, this might not be the case because you can be very fixated. Although in truth, when we talk about being neurodivergent, you can be fixated with ADHD and being gifted and talented. And it's the rigidity in autism that is tied to a schedule or a routine, providing some semblance of normalcy and comfort that is a delineating factor when we talk about neurodivergence. But there are some superpower skills that come as a result if you can break away from your routine, such as when you're quantum traveling. But that is an advanced topic that we'll get to a little bit later. For right now, I just want to keep it at this level where I believe that being neurodivergent is a huge asset when we talk about reality shifting and quantum psychology. The mind is more complex, is more able to theorize, to go out on limbs, to go out in many, many different branches, and to break away from the binary thinking that we see in neurotypical psychology. And when we start to understand the neuroscience of consciousness, we start to understand how the mind works at a binary level, because that's where most of us are coming from. We are originating from binary societies, and binary societies are really a reflection of our complexity as humans. And so we can measure the complexity of our psychology by measuring the complexity of our technology, right? And it's that whole SO above, SO below phenomenon, but that's more metaphysical than I want to talk about in this moment. We will build tools that have the sophistication of our internal workings. And so during the Industrial Revolution, which thank God we're past that point, because looking into the history of it, like socially, wow, we were still really primitive. Corporations were like bloodbathing their employees who were asking for time off. And, can I get 1 day a week off? No, we're killing your family, and okay, I'm being hyperbolic, of course, but there was actually bloodshed, and a lot of people lived miserable existences because society was going through this overhaul. And there were some people, some thought leaders at the time, and I cover this in my series, Are We Preparing for a Revolution? I cover it in detail. But there were some thought leaders that helped to push society to be more efficient and to develop things like the infrastructure that we needed to become a global society. And it just so happened that they were motivated by greed and profit, which is a powerful motivator, right? And part of me thinks that, just as a sidebar, I'm also neurodivergent, if you don't already know. I'm willing to bet that you are too. So part of the benevolence that I think is actually an undercurrent to all of this is that we are able to be manipulated by things like greed. And as a result, I know it sounds weird to say it that way, right? But think about it. Let's just say that we had a populace of all Mother Teresas. Do you think that we would have skyscrapers? Fuck no, we wouldn't have we wouldn't even have trains. You know what I mean? It takes a certain level of motivation to bring order into chaos. And back then, the world was very chaotic. And so as a result of that pressing drive for money and for greed, we were able to pull together some amazing feats of humanity. But these amazing feats of humanity also happen to be, I believe, very primitive, based in 0 and 1 dichotomous thinking. You can only have one wife, one husband, one life. You're either dead, you're alive, you're awake, you're asleep, stop or go, right or wrong. Are you a man? Are you a woman? And so now that we've fast forward years into the future, we see a blurring of this represented in our society. We're no longer just white and black, figuratively and literally speaking. And as a result, we see an increase in sophistication in our technology, which is represented by the advents in quantum computing and AI and this new revolution that we are embarking on, which is very exciting. And I happen to believe that our primary motivating factors are different than greed. Like, I look at some of the leaders in the world, and I'm not saying all of them, and I know some of you are going to disagree with me, but I look at some of the thought leaders that are bringing in this wave of innovation, and they don't appear to be motivated by the same things that the Baron robbers were, where people would spit whenever they said one of their names. Like, so-and-so. Now we have a different relationship with the leaders of innovation and change. We have a different relationship with the motivating factors that are, I believe, orienting more towards humanitarianism ideals than we have in the past, which I think is great. But this observation gets lost sometimes. So when we think about the nature of consciousness, we also need to think about the fact that it too is fluid and it too is undergoing a revolutionary change. And so the studies that I have read and that I'm going to synthesize for you, I think are important, but I actually feel that science as a whole, particularly the reductionist materialistic approach, is in need of an overhaul. And I read one study today that was published in 2022 talking about the decision-making matrix that we have in our minds. And this was published by Hans. Oh, I can't even remember how to say his last name. He's from Sweden. Okay, I looked it up because I still have it up. Hans Liljenström, which I'm probably butchering. I'm so sorry, but I'm going to link it in the description box because it's a free paper and I really like his review of the literature as well as his study, which I haven't completely gotten into the meat of what he was representing. I understand the greater point, but I started this recording before I was able to finish the paper. So he goes into whether or not we have free will based on the way that our consciousness is structured, based on what has come before, and then based on what he comes to conclude as well. And essentially, and I love the way that he compares and contrasts and critically analyzes some studies back in the 80s all the way up until now, looking at things holistically. And the point that he makes very elegantly that I have gotten to is that the studies themselves are flawed, first of all, but based on what we can assess globally is that we have patterns, very sophisticated patterns of almost like an operating system that's running in our brains that is a little bit ahead of our personal awareness, kind of like being in a car and we want to accelerate. When we are conscious entities, we believe that we are the ones that are deciding to put our foot on the accelerator and then the car goes. And the case that he's making is actually that there are some processes in the brain that are already hitting the accelerating pedal before we actually quote unquote decide, or before we are aware that we decide to do this. And then the point that he makes is that there are different driving, motivating factors for how this is influenced. And we have an emotional, intuitive system. I personally believe that these two are distinct, although they can be confounded. But there is an intuitive system that operates outside of emotion, although it is frequently intertwined with emotion. And then separate from that is a logical, rational system that is pretty much our higher awareness that is deciding how to synthesize information, how to decide based on our personal experience, our memories, how we feel about it, etc. But that takes more time. And that takes more intentional awareness. And that meanwhile, we've already decided and we've already started executing things in the background that are leading us to putting our foot on the accelerating pedal. But we don't really know that because it's on the order of half a second in some cases. So what is powerful about this is that we believe that we are free will operators, right? But in truth, we are operating pretty much in the passenger seat, thinking that we're in the driver's seat. And so this becomes a hindrance when we start talking about reality shifting, because it takes a certain level of hyper awareness and conscious understanding. And I happen to believe that this is part of what is outdated in science, in one part. There are many things that I disagree with, even though I think that Hans has done an amazing job at synthesizing the material. I actually disagree on several points with the scientific practice as a whole and not differentiating consciousness very well. And he goes into the first part of the paper saying that we don't even agree on what consciousness is. And I agree with him, right? There are some delineating factors beyond the species level consciousness that he differentiates. And he'll say, like, humans are the most conscious species because we have the ability to self-reflect and to be self-aware. And then he references some developmental milestones of when this occurs in humans. And then pretty much says that humans are hierarchically speaking more conscious than other species because we demonstrate this. I disagree with that now. I know that that is a common materialist, reductionist approach. I used to have that perspective being a scientist, but now I see that there's another level of consciousness that can be differentiated even among humans. And I believe that the results of the studies would be different if that delineation could be effectively made in our research. And in lieu of that, what that means is that we're all kind of lumped together. And very often it's undergraduates or just people that, are signing up for studies. And so we don't have a clear picture of whether or not this brain system or the systems that are discussed in these consciousness research articles are really pertinent and relevant for you as a reality shifter who is awake beyond the average human, right? And so that is my main critique with all of this, my big caveat in saying these scientific studies. I think that they get us to a certain point of our awakening, but once we start talking about quantum psychology and once we start anchoring into a quantum existence and understanding ourselves at a multi-dimensional level, and we demonstrate the hyper awareness to be cognizant of our inner workings of our mind, and we intimately understand the philosophy of our mind, then we can start to break away from some of these limitations of these consciousness studies. That is the main point. So we'll use it as foundational material to get us to understand that in a binary psychological existence, this is true. And this is a limitation. But then we can uncap ourselves. And I believe that I've done it. And I believe that other people are doing it. And I believe that we're not studied, at least not in the dimension that I exist in. So another really interesting thing is that our perceptual system, everybody agrees on this, our perceptual system is really what dictates our experience of reality. And it just so happens that not only is our perceptual system faulty, but it is also delayed. And what I like is that Hans also talks about this, briefly touches on this, that we are essentially operating on a delay, and building a simulation in our minds. And I believe that this is because our brains are wired to be highly, highly efficient. And I see this because I have a little baby who's 8 months old, and her brain is not efficient. And as a result, she struggles. And so to navigate this material world, we have to build these programs of efficiency because we need to free up our cycles to be able to have conversations like this. If we were having to learn a chair every single day, we as a species would not get very far, right? We definitely wouldn't be building quantum computers because we would be figuring out how to sit and stand every single day. So these programs that our brains are doing at a fundamental level help us to navigate the world. During our developmental cycle, that's when these are laid down. And these are hugely beneficial for predicting whether or not we're safe, whether or not we're fed, whether or not we're okay. And then once we master that, then we go at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's like whether or not we're recognized, whether or not we're approved of, and then it goes on and on, whether or not we have community, the support that we want, and whether or not we're self-actualized, the luxury of self-exploration. And so these programs build on top of each other in this layered fashion that computes our, with a relatively sophisticated predictive analysis, computes our expectation of reality. And this is also very important to understand when we talk about reality shifting. And this is where tons of people talk about mindset. Dr. Joe Dispenza does a very excellent job of this, I believe. And he also talks about 95% of our programming is subconscious. And I believe that he's talking about this effect that we are essentially living in a simulation of what has come before and what we expect to come as a result of that. And we can hack this. This is definitely hackable. And other scientists in the consciousness community talk about the reticular activating system, which is where you attend to grows. And there's some elegant research that's already been done on this, which I think is very powerful for our understanding that we can hone our brain, we can hone our eyes to look at certain things. And if you are very negatively oriented, then you're only going to be looking at and attending to the negative things. And so then you need a lot of personal hacking to shift that into a positive experience for you to then shift your reality to be positive. And so I don't want to rehash all of that because I feel that it is really powerfully already stated with many thought leaders out there. Instead, what I would like to shift our attention to is some interesting studies done in the visual systems that I think are incredibly powerful to understand. Our vision is also on a tiny bit of a delay, but that's not all. What is more fascinating is that when there is a deviation that is too far from what our baseline sense of reality can handle, our sense of familiarity is very, very important. And when there is too much of a deviation, our brains will actually, the simulation and our minds will omit and edit out that which deviates too much. Isn't that interesting? And so as a reality shifter, we need to be cognizant of these processes that are happening in the background of our minds, because I happen to believe that our familiarity is so important, our predictive analyses are so important that they actually drive a convergence of linearity that prevent us from perceiving the fact that we are shifting in and out of worlds all the time on a daily basis. And this is what I'd like to leave you with, which is, if you could rewind half a second and then freeze frame your vision, what do you think you would see that is outside the scope of your quote unquote normal reality? Because what I have found is that there is an awakening of the perceptual system. And once you understand this scientific fact that keeps you rate limited in a binary existence and binary cognition, once you understand that your brain is wired and oriented to keep you in the same and in the familiar, then you understand that when you're coming from a binary society where you have been entrained and taught for your entire life that there is only one plane of existence, then you understand that your cognition has been primed to omit any evidence to the contrary. Isn't that powerful to think about? That now all of a sudden you could go from the passenger seat where there's only one road, one highway, and you're just driving on it. Yeah, you can take exits, you can go visit your friends and your family, you can go visit new towns, but there's only one world, right? Now all of a sudden you have the ability at your fingertips to realize that there are several worlds. Maybe, just maybe. I would like to open that conversation thread if it's not already been open for you. And for some of my listeners, I know that it has. So how do we then train our brains and hack our sensory systems to allow for the deviations and perceptions to go quantum style? So if you are interested working one-on-one with me for coaching, I'm open to that right now. Ultimately, I want to have a cohort of people that I can bring down to Mexico, or we can go to some other luxurious place in the world that's comfortable, luxurious. It doesn't have to be luxurious, but I like it to be. And have psychedelic retreats where we can practice some of this reality shifting. But before we get there, we need to be sure that we have a framework of understanding so you don't lose your shit in your day-to-day world. And when you go back home, you can go back home to a thread that you're comfortable with. And so if you are interested in reality shifting and doing some experimental techniques, particularly if you're in a nightmare realm, definitely reach out to me and we can go through the screening process. I don't have all the answers. I am still figuring it out, but I do kind of have a little bit of a hang on things. And so if you want to practice, if you want to experiment, if you want to reality shift together or co-create a new existence, then let's work together. Feel free to reach out to me at sacredjourneyproductions@gmail.com.